Welcome to I'm Rachel Branch, and I am so happy once again, pleased and honored that Mr. H. John Fisher is going to join us. And he's the Fair Housing Manager of Wayfinders in Springfield. He has a wealth of information and background. We've, for so many years, brought up just about every topic you can think of, and we always cover the Fair Housing and Civil Rights conferences that have been going on for 17 years, and we will again be covering the conference that's coming up in April of 2024. But on our last program, we talked about every conference. John gives a presentation on housing, Fair Housing 101, and we're going to devote the program to that topic because it is so important and it is the foundation of everything you might want to know about fair housing. Welcome, John.
Well, it's wonderful to be back here again.
And we know you'll be here again and again, as many times as you'll say yes. But so we could go right ahead and you could start wherever you want, and I'll play citizen questioner and ask you questions if it would be something I think our audience might want to understand more fully.
Okay, good. Sounds great. I mean, I think, first of all, I'm going to jump a little bit as I go along because there are fair housing rights, and then there are the rights somebody has as a tenant or as a proper buyer of property or something like that. And they really overlap to some extent. But sometimes I'll get I get calls from people. Sometimes I get a call, somebody saying, well, my fair housing rights have been violated in some way. And when you talk to them, you realize that technically speaking, they may have been treated unfairly, but it's not strictly fair housing. But that still doesn't mean it isn't a set of rights they have. So let me try and
separate them.
Separate them a little bit first of all. There are so-called fair housing rights. Those have to do with the fact that when somebody wants to rent a home, buy a home, get out a mortgage loan, anything of that nature, they basically should be treated by whoever they're asking to rent from, whatever. They should be treated essentially fairly based upon the actual criteria of whether they qualify, whether they have enough money to pay the rent, if you will, whether they have a history of having been a good tenant and so forth. Those are in quotes legitimate factors, although sometimes there may be some reasons why that happened. But nonetheless, those are the factors that people normally make a decision based on. But what should never come into the thinking is stuff that has, in a sense, nothing to do with whether you're a good tenant, nothing to do with whether you're a good buyer. It's who you are, okay? That concept is so-called protected categories. And there's a whole bunch of them. There's the basic series set by federal law, which are race, religion, color, national origin. Again, I'm going to use the term sex rather than gender because gender is a little bit more specific. But when you think about sex, you have to also bring all the other aspects, gender and so forth, into it. The so-called these are the federal laws. And then there's also the state laws. And I believe most of the people who'll be watching us are from Massachusetts, so I think you also have some followers down in Connecticut too, if I'm not mistaken.
And Bennington, Vermont.
Yes, and Vermont
and wherever the link goes, so we don't know.
Who knows where we're talking to. But generally, the states surrounding Massachusetts, certainly Connecticut, Vermont, they have essentially the same state laws, although they're worded a little bit differently, but their purpose is about the same. And so what all of these things do is they set up something called a protected category. Now, a protected category, I'll go into what they are, but you cannot do certain things to somebody who's trying to rent from you or buy from you or take out a loan from you, based upon the fact that they are a member of one or more of these protected categories. And again, those are essentially race, religion, color, your sexual, you're actually both your sex, the simple old-fashioned so-called birth sex. I realize it's much more complicated than that. So really the gender questions, your sexual preference, whether or not you are a veteran, whether you have a disability, don't want to forget anybody.
National origin?
What's that?
National
origin, yes, absolutely. Religion. Basically, I think I mentioned veteran status already. This varies a little bit from state to state, but if you have, for example, some sort of a rental subsidy, or you're getting TAFDC, some sort of assistance, that cannot be held against you.
TAF.
renting. Yeah, it's going to...
For the audience, what's TAF?
Okay, the TAFDC is transitional assistance, basically. It's what would have at one time, going way back, been called in quotes welfare. But it's basically you have some sort of subsidy that you, for whatever reason, disability, something that you are getting, which is a legitimate source of income, and in fact probably more reliable than anyone's job.
Especially these days.
Yes, especially these days. And so anyway, your source of income, and again, it will vary from state to state. Connecticut says it a little bit differently than Massachusetts. Massachusetts actually says that you have some sort of a source of rental or source of subsidy, not necessarily just rental subsidy. Connecticut talks about source of income. But anyway, all of these things are protected categories, okay? And with a protected category, it's illegal not just to refuse to rent to somebody or sell to somebody or give them a loan based on that fact. It's also illegal to, if you will, inquire about it, okay? To ask about it. Ask what's your national background? Are you gay or straight? Anything that has to do with who you are, those really
because
basic
those
core
questions
things.
could poison the ability for the person to rent or buy,
Right, and they
because
have
somebody
nothing to
is
do with
going to
whether
refuse
someone's-
them.
Yeah, I mean, if you get right down to it, sometimes when I'm talking to landlords, because occasionally I get someone says, well, the government's telling me who I have to rent to and so forth. And actually, probably the landlords are, as much as anybody, protected by these limitations, because what it says is it forces the landlord to go back and make the decision on real objective criteria.
But also the landlords think somebody's being subsidized, but actually they're getting benefits like fire and police and all the governmental benefits that everyday citizens get living in communities.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is based on who you are, what you are. If you're any of those protected categories, you can't refuse to sell or rent to somebody. You can't run an ad saying that you're going to do so. You're not supposed to inquire into the protective categories. I mean, it may be a person, what are your religious beliefs, or do you not have religious beliefs? All of these things are questions that get to the kind of the core of who you are, and since they have nothing to do with whether or not you're going to be a good tenant, they should just never enter into this situation, and if someone wants them to be private, they should be private. So anything like running an ad, or setting special conditions that are essentially, however they may, that might effectively block somebody from it. I can talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But the point is, all of these things are really not a valid reason for not renting to somebody, not selling to somebody, and you sort of you break the law when you do it. Again, there are some exceptions to some of these laws, but they are very limited, and generally even trying to get into what the exceptions are. Under Massachusetts law, for example, some of the fair housing laws don't apply if it's a two-family property where the owner lives in one apartment, they're renting the other apartment. But first of all, that doesn't apply to everything. Race, for example, which is really your original protected category, race, across the board, you cannot discriminate based on race. It's not legal, and as a matter of fact, under federal law, it's been illegal since 1866. Not 1960s. Some of the times people think, oh, well, yeah, that was a civil rights.
After Reconstruction, after the Civil
That's
War.
Reconstruction,
Yeah.
exactly, after the Civil War. Now, it's kind of interesting. You go into this, and there was a period right after Reconstruction where it was enforced, particularly in the old states of the Confederacy. And then you watch the various courts, including the Supreme Court, do backflips to try to avoid having to deal with that, or having to say, well, it's not really if you have separate but equal, and all of those kinds of things. But all of that stuff really got tossed out. It's, if you will, hopefully as people became wiser and just people really started to understand the effects of how this worked, it became very clear that there really are no exceptions, no special cases, or what have you. Across the board, it is illegal to discriminate based on race. If you're in Massachusetts, for example, it's illegal also to discriminate based on whether or not somebody has a rental subsidy, or somebody is getting, as I say, the TFDC, or disability payments, or something like that. So that's a thing, and I think sometimes it becomes very subtle. And this is, you've heard me, I think we talked before, we talked about the duck, that if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, hey guys, it's probably a duck. And so that it may not, someone may not simply say, oh, you are, what are you, a national origin from a country I don't like. I sometimes, I'll just pick on Switzerland arbitrarily, but whatever. So it's, you're Swiss ancestry, therefore I'm not going to rent to you. Or, sometimes you could even, if you say, all right, I'm going to rent to you because you're a Swiss ancestry, but because of whatever my belief system, I'm going to say, yeah, but you can't eat fondue or have cuckoo clocks or whatever. I mean,
those are good examples.
Ridiculous in a sense when you
yeah.
look at it that way, but in fact, it's always ridiculous when you do that. So you can have special conditions, things of that nature. So
No, but when you're talking about special conditions, Section 8, does that still go with the person, or does that go with the apartment? And you're talking about subsidized housing.
Subsidized housing, yeah. Section 8, there are really, in Massachusetts, two major programs with a lot of variation. There's a so-called Section 8, which is a housing choice voucher program. And then there's also something called the Massachusetts Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, MRVP, which is very similar in the way it works to Section 8, but it's state funds. It's a smaller program, but it works very much the same way. Section 8 goes back to Section 8 of when you're talking about some of the original acts and so forth. But Section 8, there's essentially two ways you run into it. So the answer to your question is both. That in some cases, the majority of cases nowadays, somebody will show that they meet certain eligibility requirements, which are basically largely that you are of a limited income, some other things, and that you really, practically speaking, what happened is you got on a waiting list. because the federal money, the Section 8 money, which is a federal program, comes down distributed through the states, through the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, EOHLC. It used to be called DHCD, but it changed its name recently. But in any event, what happens is that money comes down, so it's federal money passing through the state and usually being administered by either a regional nonprofit or a particular local housing authority, something of that nature. And so what you do to qualify for that is you, number one, register for it. You know, you do an application. That puts you on a waiting list. If you're on that waiting list, it's extremely important that if you move, change your address, change your phone number, you let them know right away. Because unfortunately, the waiting list can be 10 or 15 years. It is awful. This is the demand, this is a supply. You know, there's just this huge in between. So you really are waiting for, you know, people hopefully to finally find a better job or and sometimes just pass away. But, you know, as openings happen, you kind of move up on the waiting list. But if you've moved or changed your address, because they would check on this every now and then, are you still interested? Do you still need it? So if you don't happen to have let them know, you might get so-called purged from the waiting list. You're removed from it.
Unfortunately, the paperwork is monstrous, but you have to pay attention to it.
It is extremely important you do this.
For purposes, particularly for our program, you're fair housing manager at Wayfinders. And what is Wayfinders' purpose in this discussion that we're having? What do you do that involves fair housing? What, and this is a kind of an organization that speaks to what we're talking about in Fair Housing 101.
Right. Well, actually, let me break it into two pieces here, because there's the me, and then there's the agency as a whole. The agency as a whole does a lot of different things, and among things is it's one of those places where you can go to apply for the Section 8 program, to get on the waiting list, to wait that 10 years until it comes up. Once that 10 years is over, though, now you can go out and pretty much rent from anybody. And again, it is a violation of those fair housing rights. It's illegal for somebody to turn you down because of the fact that you have a Section 8 voucher. Because the whole purpose of a Section 8 voucher is you can afford the rent. That's really all it's about. So in any event, Wayfinders oversees the Section 8 program, at least a big hunk of it in this area, but there are other parts of the state, other states where other agencies do this. It also operates subsidized housing, and that's another way in which some of the federal monies can come down, is there are also properties where there may be a rental subsidy. So in other words, again, if you can't afford the rent, you pay what you can afford. But in that case, the subsidy goes with the building. So there, again, it's very important if you have a rental subsidy, you know which one you have and which one you're using.
Can you have more than one kind of person?
Oh, yes.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. I mean, but there is usually, if you have, you're going to use one or the other. I mean, if you have a Section 8, it means you can really rent anywhere. If you don't have a Section 8 or some sort of equivalent subsidy, then you apply to the various, the various subsidized buildings, and they will, if you come to the top of their waiting list, which is often much shorter than the Section 8 list, but when you come to the top of that list, then what you do is you move in and you pay what you can afford to pay. But if you leave the apartment, the subsidy doesn't go with you. It stays with that apartment. So there really are two flavors of this, and Wayfinders does both. We also do home ownership programs. We do a number of other, we work with economic development, helping to get people get startup loans for businesses. We have a very robust program that works with people to help them become first-time home buyers. We have an emergency subsidy program for people who, for whatever reason, have fallen behind in their rent or their mortgages because of the fact, particularly during COVID, there was a lot of it, but even now, if you've lost your job or something's happened, sometimes there's help to just get you caught up on your rent, for example. There's a program that deals with people who are trying to get started that has a subsidy, but it's for a limited period of time. It sort of helps move you into the apartment and subsidizes you while you're getting back on your feet with the assumption you can keep going. And there's a bunch of other things, community outreach and so forth. We do a lot of things.
So everything you're talking about, this is really part of Housing 101.
This is-
These
this-
are all pertinent facts to what
Absolutely.
individual needs to know,
Absolutely. The basic,
or family, I should say.
yeah, anyone, individual, family, the bottom line is you cannot be discriminated against based upon who you are, number one. Number two, if you happen to have a disability, then this is a special situation. A disability is defined as anything, any condition which interferes with any major activity of daily living. So that could be dressing yourself, that could be eating, that could be the fact that you have to be in a wheelchair, that you're hearing impaired, visually impaired, that you have an emotional problem, or possibly PTSD or something that basically interferes with any of those activities of daily living. And this is kind of across the board, but particularly in housing and fair housing, that means that if you do, you've got the right to have a reasonable accommodation made to that. In other words, if there's some way that something to do with your housing, whether that's your ability while you're applying to be accepted as a person, or whether you've been living there 2 days or a week or 20 years or what have you, something that starts to interfere with your ability to be properly housed, it can be legitimate to ask that the landlord make a reasonable accommodation. The things people think of as the ramps to get into a building. If somebody has a hearing problem, putting in sort of the strobe light in place of the regular doorbell, those kinds of things. That reasonable accommodation has to be such that it's reasonable. It can't place an undue financial or administrative burden on the person providing it. And that can vary. If it's a small landlord, what's asked of the costs that would be asked of that small landlord would not be the same as a large, a large landlord, or something again like Wayfinders, where there would be a much more assumption of ability to pay. There also are for disabled people who are trying to get a reasonable accommodation. Sometimes, if the cost is going to be a factor, there are programs again that can help with this. Just like there are programs that can help first-time home buyers, or programs that help with de-letting. So that's kind of the basic.
De-letting is a big.
De-letting
it's
is
been
a
big,
huge thing.
Big issue.
I should mention also, just something, I shared this with you recently, but I just came upon, there was a very interesting study which was just done, which essentially, I'm not going to go into too much of the ways in which it was done, but this was published in the Quarterly Journal of Statistics, of Economics, rather. What it basically they did is they went to about roughly 6,000 landlords who had properties for rent in 5 major metropolitan areas. And they had essentially people doing what's called testing, where it was people would call with the implication that they were of different ethnic groups, in this case, Black and Hispanic, or none of the above, if you will, and talking about how difficult it was. And I mean, the basic bottom line here, this is where it's a duck again. It isn't someone often would say, no, I'm not going to take you because of who you are. Rather, what happened is that there was probably an 8% reduced chance that somebody was going to get called back, that people ended up having to pay more based on the fact that they were of color, as I say, or in this case of Latinx origin. And that came out to, interesting enough, somewhere between 3 to 5% of their gross annual income. In other words, it literally, there's a surcharge, effectively speaking, on the fact that you're a minority. So again, this is the kind of the subtle, if you will, the subtle way in which this stuff happens. Again, it's not usually egregious like it used to be, but this is a subtle way in which it happens.
It just seems that there's never-ending ways that people think to people of color and other, to overwhelm them with racial discrimination and economically. I mean, it's just awful. But
Yeah.
that's why we keep talking about it, and we will keep talking about
Right.
it. This was quite a study, though,
Yeah.
that you brought up. And here we are, Jen, we keep coming
To
the
the end.
But I want to continue this conversation on Housing 101, and I want to do it every month or every other month with you,
I would be
because
delighted
this
to,
is
because there's
really,
so much to cover.
there is, and we never want to jam something into a program. That we want to give people the opportunity to listen and think about what we're saying, and then have access to respond to it.
Yeah. And of course, if people have questions, feel free to call
That will
me.
be on
I
our
think my number
screen.
pops up every now and
If
then.
it isn't on the screen, we will put it on
well,
the credits. They can always
Okay.
visit John
Yeah.
Fisher at wayfinders.org.
Org. Yeah, we're an org.
You're an org.
Yes.
And BCTC is an org too.
Yes.
So, yes, I hope we will plan another program very soon, and I'll try to catch you before you go out the door. But as always, I want to thank you for being a very special and frequent guest on Solutions Rising. Every time you come, there's a wealth of information, and I am so grateful. And especially with the dire housing needs today and the mounting homelessness, and which we will discuss again. Thank you so much, John Fisher.
My pleasure always.
Thank you. And if each one of us picked up one problem and solved it, imagine the incredible view we would all have of Solutions Rising. Please be part of the solution, and please become aware, whether you're a landlord or a tenant, to try to make the housing situation, which is just horrendous at this point, see what you can do to help solve some of the problems. Thank you.